Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. Something was wrong at a farm in the north of England. Nobody could yet say what, but the dog knew first. He knew before any letter was written, before any telephone rang. An old sheepdog sat at a gate at the end of a lane and waited. He did not bark. He did not pace. He simply watched the empty track, hour after hour, day after day, as if he already knew someone was coming, someone who did not yet know she was needed. In London, a woman named Helen Bramwell had no idea any of this was happening. She did not know her grandfather had died. She did not know a farm now belonged to her. She did not know a dog was waiting for her, alone, at a gate she had not stood beside since she was a child. But the dog knew. He had always known things first. He had known weather before it turned. He had known when a ewe was in trouble on ground he could not even see. And in the last months of an old man's life, he had known something no doctor had yet said aloud, lying close against a failing heart, night after night, long before anyone had the words for what was happening. Now the old man was gone. And still the dog kept his patient watch at the gate, waiting for the one thing he could not simply walk out and fetch for himself. Her. The letter that would finally send her north arrived on a Tuesday, which Helen Bramwell would remember afterward as an unremarkable sort of day for something to end and something else to begin. She had been at her desk in London, in the small flat that overlooked a row of other small flats, the kettle just coming to the boil in the next room, when the solicitor's letter came through the post with its stiff cream envelope and its careful, old-fashioned hand. She knew before she opened it, in the way one sometimes does, that it concerned her grandfather. She had not seen him in what felt like a very long stretch of ordinary years, the kind that pass without any single one of them seeming decisive, until suddenly they have added up to something you cannot quite undo. Her grandfather, Edwin, had kept a hill farm in the high dales of Yorkshire, a place Helen remembered mostly through the fog of childhood summers, when the visits had still happened and the journey north had not yet come to feel like a country she had emigrated from. She remembered stone walls threading up the fellside like handwriting. She remembered the particular cold of the flagstone floor in the farmhouse kitchen and the smell of wood smoke that seemed to live permanently in the curtains and the wool blankets. And even she had always thought in her grandfather's cardigans, and she remembered, though only vaguely, the way there always seemed to be a dog nearby, some steady, watchful presence at the edge of every memory, lying in doorways, following at heel, waiting by gates. The letter was from a Mr. Fenn, of a small practice in the market town nearest the farm, and it explained, in the measured and faintly apologetic language solicitors use for the largest news, that her grandfather had died peacefully in the autumn, at home, and that the farm and all it contained had passed to her as his only remaining family. There was a second page, shorter, in a slightly different hand, noting a few practical matters. The keys were with Mr. Fenn's office. The farm had not been let or sold in his lifetime, and stood exactly as he had left it. And there was, the letter said, a dog, an elderly sheepdog named Moss, who had been Edwin's constant companion for a great many years, and whom Mr. Fenn's office had been feeding and looking in on since the funeral, at something of a loss as to what should happen to him next. The letter noted, with what Helen would later recognize as a kind of careful understatement, that the dog seemed to be waiting for something, and that nobody at the practice had quite liked to guess what. She sat with the letter for a long while before she did anything else. The kettle had long since boiled and gone quiet again. Outside, the ordinary traffic of the city continued exactly as it always did, indifferent to the fact that somewhere north of it, a stone farmhouse and a dog and a whole unclaimed life were waiting on her decision. She thought about her grandfather's letters, which had come perhaps twice a year, always brief, always about the weather and the sheep and very little else, and how she had read them quickly and answered them slowly, and told herself each time that she would visit properly soon. She thought about the last of these letters, which she still had somewhere in a drawer, and which had said nothing at all about failing health, because that had never been his way. He had preferred to let a thing be true quietly, without asking anyone to carry it with him. It took her the better part of a week to arrange her affairs in London, a leave of absence from the office, a note to her landlady, the small, unglamorous business of packing a life into 2 cases without knowing, not truly, whether she was packing for a visit or for something longer. She found, packing, that she could not settle on an answer to that question, and in the end she simply packed for both, folding in a few books she loved alongside sturdier boots and a coat meant for weather rather than appearances. The journey north began at a London terminus thick with departures, and it changed character somewhere past the middle of the country, the way it always had when she was a child, though she had forgotten this until it was happening again. The train grew emptier as it climbed. The towns thinned into villages, and the villages thinned into something sparser still. Low stone farmhouses set into green folds of land, sheep scattered like unswept snow on slopes that seemed too steep for anything to graze comfortably. At a junction station with a single platform and a waiting room that smelled of coal, dust, and rain, she changed onto a smaller branch line, little more than 2 carriages, that wound its way further into the hills, past becks running quick and brown with recent rain, past dry stone walls climbing the fells in patterns that looked, from a distance, like the careful stitching of some enormous quilt. By the time she stepped down onto the platform of the market town, the light had gone soft and low in that particular way of northern autumn afternoons, gold at the edges and grey at the centre, and the air had a bite to it that the London air had not had, clean and cold, and faintly of wood smoke, as though the whole town were heated by 100 small fires she could not see. She found Mr. Fenn's office above a bakery on the high street, up a narrow staircase that creaked with the particular confidence of very old wood, and was shown in by a young clerk to a room lined with box files and the smell of paper that has sat undisturbed for a long time. Mr. Fenn himself was an older man, silver-haired and unhurried, with the manner of someone who had delivered a great many difficult letters in his career, and had long ago learned to do it kindly. He shook her hand and expressed, in a few careful sentences, his sorrow at her grandfather's passing, and his sense that Edwin had been well liked and well respected in the valley, a man who kept his own counsel and his word in equal measure. He produced from a drawer a heavy iron key, old and slightly cold to the touch. Along with a folder of papers, Helen did not immediately have the composure to read, and set them on the desk between them, with the particular gentleness lawyers reserve for objects that matter more than their weight suggests. "There is the matter of the dog," Mr. Fenn said, after a pause, in the tone of a man arriving at the part of the conversation he had been quietly saving. "Moss, your grandfather's dog. He is getting on in years now, as sheepdogs go, though there is plenty of work left in him yet, by all accounts. We have had one of the young lads from the practice going up to feed him and let him out since the funeral. But I will tell you honestly, Miss Bramwell, the animal has not been himself in the way you might expect. He is not pining. Exactly. He does not lie about the place looking lost, the way I have seen other dogs do when they have lost someone. He seems, if anything, to be waiting, sitting at the gate a good deal, looking down the lane. The lad who feeds him says it is as if the dog knows someone is coming, and is simply getting on with being patient about it until they arrive." Helen said she did not know quite what to say to that, and Mr. Fenn said that neither, in truth, did he, though he had lived long enough in this valley to have stopped being surprised by what a good sheepdog seemed to know before anyone told him. He said her grandfather had always maintained, without any drama in the saying of it, that Moss knew things first, knew the weather turning a full day before the forecasts caught up with it, knew when a ewe was in trouble out on the fell before any shepherd had noticed her missing, knew visitors were coming up the lane long before they came into sight. Mr. Fenn said this the way a man reports a fact he has decided not to argue with, whatever he privately makes of it, and Helen found she was glad of that, glad not to have the strangeness of it explained away too quickly. There was a car arranged to take her the remaining distance, up out of the town and along a road that narrowed with every mile, hedgerows giving way to open fellside, dry stone walls running alongside like a second, older road laid down long before the first. The driver, a taciturn man who seemed to know every turning by feel rather than by looking, pointed out the farm before she could properly see it, a low grey shape gathered into a fold of the hill with a scatter of outbuildings around it, and, behind it, the fell rising steep and bare and already touched at its highest point with something that might have been the first thin suggestion of frost. He left her at the end of the lane, where the metalled road gave out into a rougher track, and said the farm was a short walk on, that he did not care to take the car over the ruts this late in the day, with rain coming. Helen did not mind. She found, standing there with her 2 cases and the last of the daylight thinning around her, that she wanted the walk, wanted the particular slowness of arriving on foot rather than being delivered, the way the driver had described it, as though something in her understood that this last stretch needed to be crossed at a human pace. The lane climbed gently between walls furred with moss and lichen, the kind of green-grey that only comes from a very great deal of weather over a very great many years. Rooks called somewhere overhead, unseen, and the wind came down off the fell smelling of wet bracken and peat, and faintly of wood smoke so that before she had seen the farmhouse chimney she already knew there was a fire lit somewhere ahead of her, though she could not have said how that was possible, since no one was meant to be there. And then, rounding the last bend where the wall gave way to a wooden gate hung between two stone gateposts gone soft-edged with age, she saw him. The dog was sitting at the gate exactly as Mr. Fenn's clerk had described, upright and quite still, ears forward, watching the lane in the particular, attentive way of an animal that has been taught, over a very long life, that patience is a kind of work worth doing properly. He was black and white, the coat a little grey now about the muzzle, one ear folded slightly at the tip in a way that suggested some old injury long healed and long forgotten. He did not bark. He did not rush toward her the way she had half expected, the way dogs do in the stories, all noise and unguarded joy. He simply rose, unhurried, tail beginning a slow, certain sweep, and walked to meet her at a pace that was somehow entirely without doubt, as though the only surprising thing in the whole arrangement was that it had taken her quite this long to arrive. He reached her and pressed his head once against her knee, and then turned, without any further ceremony, and led her the last stretch of the lane toward the gate, glancing back only once to be sure she was following, in the manner of a creature who had done this, or something very like it, more times than could easily be counted, and saw no reason to make a great occasion of doing it again now. Helen stood at the gate for a moment with her hand resting on the dog's head, looking at the farmhouse in the last of the light. It was smaller than she remembered, and somehow larger too, the way childhood places often are. A low building of the same grey stone as the walls, two chimneys, small deep windows that had clearly been keeping the weather out for a very long time, a slate roof furred at its ridge with the same moss that grew on everything else in this valley that held still long enough. A honeysuckle, bare now for the season, had grown up one side of the door frame and been trained, at some point by some patient hand, along a wire above the lintel. The yard was swept. The wood store beside the door was stacked, neat and dry. More wood than one elderly dog could have managed on his own, which told her, before she even asked, that someone from the practice had indeed been keeping things ticking over in her absence. She let herself in with the heavy iron key, which turned in the lock with a weight and a certainty that felt, after the thin locks of her London flat, almost ceremonial. Moss went in ahead of her, unbothered, tail still moving in its slow, contented sweep, and led her not to the nearest room but straight through the kitchen and along a short dim passage to a small study at the back of the house, where he stopped and sat, quite deliberately, in front of an old leather chair positioned beside the window. Helen understood, standing in the doorway, that this had been her grandfather's chair, and that the dog had brought her to it not by accident, but because it seemed, in whatever private reckoning dogs make of such things, to be the place that mattered most, the place that needed showing to her before anything else in the house was shown. She did not sit in it, not yet. She only stood a moment with her hand on its worn arm, feeling the shape his years of sitting there had pressed into the leather, and let herself absorb, quietly and without hurry, the fact that she was standing in a room that had belonged to a man she had loved and not visited nearly enough, and that the last living thing to have kept him company in it was now sitting patiently at her feet, waiting to show her the rest. The study held a roll-top desk with its lid down, a wall of shelves given over mostly to ledgers and almanacs, and a scattering of paperback novels with cracked spines, and, on the sill, a row of small stones that she recognized. After a moment, as the sort of thing a person collects on walks, without ever quite deciding to be a collector flecked with mica, or oddly rounded, or split cleanly in two to show some vein of quartz inside. She touched none of it yet. There would be time, she told herself. For all of that, tonight there was only the fact of arriving, and the fact of the dog leading her gently from room to room as the light went from the windows, showing her, in his unhurried way, where the lamps were kept and where the kindling was stacked, and, eventually, where in the kitchen the tin of tea sat beside a chipped blue jug that had clearly been used every single morning of her grandfather's life, and would, she supposed, now be used every morning of hers. The range in the kitchen had been banked low but not allowed to go out entirely. Another small kindness from the young lad at the solicitor's office, and it took her only a little coaxing with the kindling to bring it back to a proper glow. She found bread in a crock, a little stale but good enough toasted, and butter, and a jar of bramble jam with a handwritten label in a careful, familiar hand that she recognized with a small ache as her grandfather's own. She ate, standing at the counter in the lamplight, tearing the toast rather than cutting it, while Moss lay across the doorway to the passage in the particular position of a dog who has appointed himself to a post and intends to hold it, watching her with an expression she could only have called satisfied. Outside, full dark had come down properly now, the valley folding itself away into a darkness, broken only by a scatter of far lights on the opposite fellside, and high above, more stars than she had seen in years, unblurred by any city glow, spread the whole width of the sky, in a way that made the house beneath them feel very small and very sturdy at once. She could hear, faintly, the sound of sheep somewhere out on the hill, a low, occasional call carried on the wind, and beneath that, further off, the rush of a beck running full with recent rain. It was, she thought, an enormous quiet, the kind that took some getting used to after years of a city's constant low hum. But it was not an empty quiet. It was full of small sounds she did not yet know how to place. And she found, standing at the sink with her tea going cold in her hands, that she did not mind not knowing yet. There would be time to learn what each sound meant, the way there was time for everything else this house seemed to be offering her. She banked the fire again before bed, the way she had seen done as a child without ever learning the knack of it herself, and found she managed well enough on her first attempt, the coals settling into a low, patient glow that would, she trusted, still be alive by morning. Moss followed her up the narrow stairs, his claws clicking softly on bare wood, and settled himself, without asking permission and without her thinking to deny him, on the small rug beside the bed in the room that had once been kept, she supposed, for visitors, and was tonight simply hers. She lay for a while listening to the house settle around her, the particular creaks and small movements of very old timber cooling after a day of low autumn sun, the wind finding the edges of the windows, the dogs breathing slow and even on the floor beside her. And she thought, without any great drama attached to the thought that she had not expected to feel this steady on her first night in a house she had entered as a stranger. She woke once in the deep part of the night to a sound she could not place, some shift in the wind or some small creature moving along the wall outside, and found that Moss had already lifted his head, ears forward, listening in that same attentive way he had watched the lane for her, before deciding, evidently, that whatever it was required no further attention, and lying back down with a long, settling sigh that seemed to carry his verdict on the matter more clearly than any bark could have. She found the sigh oddly reassuring, a kind of running commentary on the safety of the house that she had not known she needed until it was offered, and she slept again almost at once, more deeply than she had slept in a very long time. Morning came grey and soft, mist sitting low in the valley bottom, and the fell above only half visible through it, its highest reaches disappearing into cloud, the colour of unbleached wool. Moss was awake before her, sitting by the bedroom door with the particular stillness of a dog whose whole body is a request, and she dressed quickly in the cold room and followed him down through the dim kitchen and out into the yard, where the morning air struck her properly awake, in a way no amount of tea in London had ever quite managed. There was a modest flock of sheep in the in-by field closest to the house, and beyond them, further up, more scattered across the open fell where the walls gave out into rougher ground. And Helen understood, with a small lurch of responsibility she had not fully reckoned with until this moment, that these were now, in some sense, she did not yet know how to fill, hers to mind. She did not know the first thing about keeping sheep. She said as much, aloud, to the dog, who looked back at her with an expression that seemed to suggest this was a manageable state of affairs, and then turned and set off along the track that ran up beside the wall, glancing back to be sure she was following, exactly as he had done the evening before at the gate. He led her first to a stone trough, fed by a pipe from higher on the hill. Checking, she realized after watching him a moment that the water ran clear and the level was where it should be. A small daily inspection he seemed to consider entirely his own department. He led her next along the wall to a gap mended with a hurdle, sniffing at it with evident satisfaction that it had held through the night's wind, and then further up still, along a path worn thin and pale through the bracken, to a low stone building set into the fellside that she recognized, from the shape of it and the smell of old hay still lingering inside, as a shepherd's hut, the kind of small refuge a man might once have used to shelter through a lambing storm. She stood in the doorway of it for a while, looking out at the view it commanded, the whole valley laid out below in the thinning mist, the farmhouse chimney sending up its own thread of smoke, the beck a bright thread through the green, and understood, without being told, why a person might have loved this particular vantage above all others on the farm. Moss sat beside her, not asking to go on, simply waiting, and she had the distinct impression, fanciful as she knew it to be, that he had brought her here on purpose, to this exact spot, because it was a spot that had mattered, and because showing her the places that had mattered seemed to be, for reasons of his own, the most important task currently in front of him. They were interrupted, gently, by a call from further down the track, and Helen turned to see a broad, weathered man in a flat cap making his way up toward them with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked this ground his whole life, a black and white dog of his own trotting at his heel. He introduced himself as Jack Ridley, from the farm over the shoulder of the hill, and said he and his wife had been keeping an eye on the place since the funeral, at Mr. Fenn's asking, though he was glad. He said, looking her over with frank and not unkind assessment, to see the eye now belonged properly to someone who lived there. He talked, as they walked back down together, of her grandfather in the easy, unsentimental way of a neighbor who had known a man for decades without ever needing to make speeches about it. A man who kept his word, who was first out in bad weather and last in who did not talk over much but noticed everything. And he talked, too, of moss, in a tone that suggested this was a subject the whole valley had opinions about and had long since stopped bothering to argue over. He said Edwin used to claim, and Jack Ridley, for one, had never found reason to doubt him, that the dog always knew first. Knew a storm was coming a full day before the glass dropped, and would herd the flock down off the high ground on his own initiative before anyone had thought to send him. Knew when a ewe was cast on her back and struggling out of sight over some fold in the ground, and would fetch Edwin without being asked, simply appearing at his side and turning back the way he'd come until Edwin understood and followed. And, Jack Ridley said, his voice dropping slightly, in a register reserved for the more private sort of neighborly honesty, the dog had known about Edwin himself, toward the end, before Edwin had told a soul, had taken to lying pressed close against his chest of an evening in a way he never used to, weeks before the heart trouble was ever mentioned to the doctor, let alone to the family. Knew first, Jack Ridley said again, as though the phrase had become, over the years, simply the plainest way of describing something nobody in the valley much wanted to explain further. Helen walked the rest of the way down in a thoughtful quiet, turning the phrase over, and found that instead of unsettling her, as such things might once have done in the ordinary business of her London life, it settled something in her instead. Some small worry she had not known. She was carrying about whether her grandfather had been alone at the end, in the way she had feared. It seemed, from what Jack Ridley said, that he had not been, not really, not with a creature beside him who had known enough, in his own wordless way, to lie close and keep watch. The rest of that first full day passed in the particular, unglamorous business of learning a place, finding where the tools were kept, working out the temperament of the range, discovering that the hens, 3 of them, elderly and opinionated, required letting out each morning and shutting up each night against the fox that Jack Ridley assured her came down off the fell with reliable regularity. Moss oversaw all of it with an air of quiet supervision, never once suggesting, by look or manner, that she was doing any of it wrong, though she suspected, more than once, that she was. By the time the light began to go again, thin and gold over the western shoulder of the fell, she felt something she had not expected to feel. This soon, not settled, not yet, that would take longer than a single day, but no longer entirely a stranger either. Moss rose from where he had been dozing by the door as the shadows lengthened and walked to her, nudging her hand once with his nose, and then set off up the track again, glancing back in the manner she now recognized as an invitation rather than a demand. And she found she wanted, very much, to follow him. He led her, in the last of the light, not to the shepherd's hut this time, but a little beyond it, to a flat shelf of rock at the top of the near fell, where the whole dale opened out below, in the blue and gold hush of a hill country evening, the farmhouse smoke rising straight in the still air, the first lamp lit in the kitchen window, like a small, deliberate promise to herself that she would be coming back down to it. She sat on the cold stone, with the dog settling warm against her side, his breathing slow and even, and watched the light drain by degrees from the valley, the fells turning first gold, then rose, then a deep, quiet blue, the first stars arriving one at a time, as though testing whether the sky was ready for them. She did not think, sitting there, of anything in particular. She thought, if anything, of very little at all, which struck her as its own kind of relief after a life that had been, without her quite noticing until now, rather full of thinking. The dog beside her seemed to know, in the same wordless way he seemed to know everything else, that this was exactly the right amount of time to sit still and watch a hillside go dark. And when at last he rose and turned toward home, she rose with him, unhurried, and walked back down through the deepening blue together, the farmhouse light growing steadily nearer and warmer with every step, waiting for her the way. She understood now. It had been waiting all along. The next day brought a change in the weather that Helen would not have known to read for herself, but which Moss seemed to have anticipated before she was even properly awake. She found him at her door earlier than the morning before, more insistent in his stillness, and when she came down into the yard, she understood why almost at once the air had a different weight to it, a stillness that felt less like calm and more like held breath. And the fell above the farmhouse had lost its softness. Gone instead, a hard, flat grey that seemed to press down rather than simply sit overhead. She had barely finished her tea before Moss was at the door again, clearly of the opinion that tea was a luxury the morning could not presently afford. She followed him up the track, past the trough and the mended gap in the wall, and out onto the open fell where the flock was scattered more widely than she had seen them the day before, cropping at the thin grass with the placid indifference of creatures who have not yet noticed anything is wrong. Moss, however, had noticed. He worked without any instruction from her at all, sweeping wide around the flank of the flock in long, low arcs, gathering the outlying ewes with small, precise movements of his body alone. Never a bark, never a rush. Simply a steady, patient pressure that turned them, by degrees, back down toward the in-by field and the shelter of the walls. Helen found herself following along behind, more spectator than shepherd, though she did what she could to close gates and turn back the odd ewe who tried to break for higher ground. And by the time the whole flock was settled into the lower field, safely walled in on every side, the first fine needles of what would become, within the hour, a proper squall had begun to sting against her face. She stood in the yard afterward, breathing hard, watching the cloud come down over the tops in earnest. Swallowing the shepherd's hut and the flat rock and the whole upper fell into a single grey absence, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly what Jack Ridley had meant. Nothing about the morning had told her a storm was coming. The dog had simply known, in whatever wordless register dogs keep such knowledge, and had gone to work on it before she had so much as finished her tea. The storm held through the better part of that day, rain driving nearly sideways against the small, deep windows, the range roaring pleasantly in response to it, and Helen spent the hours it lasted doing the kind of quiet indoor work a house like this seemed to invite going properly for the first time through the boxes stacked along one wall of the study, the ones Mr. Fenn's office had left untouched out of what she supposed was a kind of respectful caution. She found, among ledgers recording lambing counts and wool prices going back further than she could easily follow, a slim, cloth-bound book that turned out, when she opened it, to be less a farm diary than something closer to a private record. Her grandfather's own hand, grown a little unsteady in its later pages, noting not just weather and stock but small human observations too. A line about the first cuckoo of a spring long past, a note about Jack Ridley's boy passing his exams, a short paragraph, dated only by season and not by any number she could find, remarking that the dog had taken to sleeping pressed against his chest of an evening, and that he supposed the dog knew something the doctors hadn't yet troubled to say aloud, and that he found, oddly, he did not mind knowing it this way rather than the other. She sat a long while with that page open on her knee, the rain loud against the glass, Moss dozing at her feet, with one ear twitching now and then at some sound in the storm too faint for her to catch, and felt something in her chest loosen that she had not entirely realized was still held tight. It was, she thought, a strange kind of comfort to learn that her grandfather had not been afraid, or had at least found his way to something steadier than fear, in the company of a creature who seemed to have made peace with the coming of an ending long before the ending itself arrived. She found herself, without quite deciding to, reaching down to rest her hand on the dog's head, and he woke just enough to press up into the touch before settling again, as though this, too, was simply part of the ordinary business of the day. By the following morning the storm had blown itself out entirely, leaving the whole dale washed and glittering, the becks running fuller and louder than before, the air so clean it seemed to have a taste to it, cold and mineral and faintly of wet stone. Helen decided, over a breakfast that was becoming almost familiar now in its small rhythms, that she would walk down into the market town for supplies, partly out of practical need, and partly, she admitted to herself, because she wanted the excuse to see the place properly in daylight, without the fog of arrival and grief clouding her first impression of it. Moss came with her, trotting ahead down the lane with the unhurried confidence of a creature entirely at home in his own territory. And the walk down, several miles by the road, passed more quickly than she expected in his company. The town, when they reached it, turned out to be a modest huddle of grey stone buildings around a market square with a stepped stone cross at its centre, worn smooth by weather and centuries of hands resting against it. A bakery, a chemist, a shop that seemed to sell everything from boot polish to birthday cards. And, tucked along one side, the narrow staircase up to Mr. Fenn's office, where she had collected her key only days before, though it felt, already, like a good deal longer. She found, going about her small errands, that the shopkeepers seemed already to know who she was before she introduced herself, in the way of small places where news of an arrival travels faster than the arrival itself. And each of them, in their own manner, had something gentle to say about her grandfather, and, more often than not, something about the dog as well. The woman at the general shop, wrapping a wedge of cheese in brown paper, told her that Moss came from a long line at the farm, that there had always been a black and white dog there for as far back as anyone in the town could remember, each one handed down in temperament if not in blood from the one before. And each one, she said with a small private smile, credited sooner or later with knowing something before it happened. "It's the land, I sometimes think," the woman said, folding the paper with brisk, practiced hands. "Teaches a dog to read weather and worry the way it teaches a farmer, only the dog gets on with it quicker, not having to argue himself into believing it first." Helen carried that thought back up the lane with her in the gathering afternoon, turning it over the way she seemed to be turning over a great many things in this valley, more slowly and more thoroughly than she had allowed herself to turn over anything in a long while. The walk back was harder going, uphill the whole way and her arms full of parcels, but Moss kept an easy pace beside her, pausing when she paused, and by the time the farmhouse chimney came into view again, sending up its now familiar thread of smoke into a sky gone the color of a ripe plum, she felt something had shifted in her, quietly and without ceremony, the way most true things seem to shift in this place. That evening, after supper, she went back to the roll-top desk in the study, drawn by some instinct she did not examine too closely, and found, tucked into a compartment at the back that she had not properly explored the day before, a single folded sheet addressed, in her grandfather's careful hand, simply to Helen. She sat a long moment before opening it, Moss settling his head across her foot, as though he understood, in his own way, that this was a moment that wanted stillness around it. The letter was short, as all his letters had been, and said little that could have surprised her by now. And yet it undid her all the same, a few lines about the farm and what it had meant to him, a few more about not minding, in the end, that she had built her life elsewhere, because a life built well elsewhere was no less a thing to be proud of than a life kept close to home. And then, near the bottom, in a hand that had grown visibly less steady, a single line asking her if she should ever find herself standing in this house, reading this letter, to be kind to the dog and to trust whatever he seemed to be telling her, because he had never yet, in all Edwin's years of listening to him, been wrong about anything that mattered. She folded the letter carefully and sat a while longer with her hand resting on Moss's head, the fire settling low and orange in the grate, the house entirely quiet around them, but for the small, ordinary sounds of old timber and older stone, and felt, for the first time since the solicitor's letter had arrived, on that unremarkable Tuesday in London, that she understood exactly what she had been given, and exactly what she meant to do with it. The days that followed took on a shape of their own. The particular unhurried rhythm of a place run by daylight and weather, rather than by clocks up with the dog at first light to let out the hens and check the trough. The long, slow walk up to the flock with the mist still lying in the folds of the land. The small satisfactions of tasks done competently that had, only days before, been entirely unfamiliar to her. She found she was sleeping more deeply than she had in years, worn pleasantly through by honest outdoor work, rather than the thin, wakeful tiredness of a desk and a screen. And she found, too, that the silence of the valley at night no longer struck her as empty, but as a kind of company in itself, full of small sounds. She was slowly learning to place the particular call of an owl, working the wall line after dark, the shift of sheep settling in the in-by field, the wind finding its way, always along the same worn path around the chimney. Each evening, when the light began to go, Moss would rise from wherever he had settled through the day and lead her, without fail, up to some part of the farm that seemed to matter, the flat rock above the shepherd's hut, or the gap in the wall where the last of the sun came through, at exactly the right angle in autumn, or simply the gate at the end of the lane, where he would sit and watch the dark come down the valley with the same patient attention he had once given to watching for her arrival. And Helen would sit with him, unhurried, and let the day settle, and find that she wanted more each evening than the one before. Nothing else in the world just then beyond this hillside, this quiet, this steady warm weight leaning against her side in the last of the light. On the evening that would close, for now, this first chapter of her time at the farm, Moss led her up past the shepherd's hut to a place she had not yet properly explored, a shallow, natural bowl in the hillside, where the ground leveled for a stretch before falling away again toward the beck. sheltered from the worst of the wind by an outcrop of grey rock, furred thick with moss, the exact color of the dog's own name. He sat, and she sat beside him, and the whole dale lay spread below them in the softening gold of a late afternoon, giving way gently to evening. The farmhouse smoke rising straight and unhurried, the flock settled and quiet in the field below. The first pale suggestion of the evening star arriving low over the western shoulder of the fell. She thought, sitting there with the dog's steady breathing beside her and the cold, clean fell air filling her lungs, of her grandfather sitting in this same bowl of ground, on some evening she would never precisely know the date of, with this same dog, or perhaps some earlier one beside him, watching this same light do this same slow, generous thing to this same valley. And she found the thought did not ache the way she might have expected. It settled instead, the way so much here had settled, into something closer to company than to loss. The light went from gold to rose to a deep, unhurried blue, and the first stars arrived one at a time, and neither of them moved until the valley below had gone properly dark. But for the single lamp Helen had left burning, without quite deciding to, in the kitchen window, a small, steady promise that she would be coming back down to it, and that this, now, whatever else it also was, had become home. The week that followed brought the first hard frost of the season. Arriving overnight and without warning to anyone but Moss, who had taken to sleeping, Helen noticed, a little closer to the kitchen range than he had the nights before, curling himself nearer the last of its warmth, as though some private calendar of his own had already turned a page she had not yet read. She woke to find the inside of her bedroom window laced with frost in patterns like fern fronds, delicate and complete, and stepped out into a yard gone hard and white and utterly silent, every blade of grass in the in-by field furred with rime, the puddles by the trough skinned over with ice, thin enough to shatter under a boot heel with a sound like breaking glass. She stood a moment in the cold, breathing it in, watching her own breath hang and drift in the still air, and felt something in her that had been holding itself carefully, cautiously, since the letter had first arrived in London, finally let go and settle. It was not a decision she could point to, exactly. No single moment where she had thought, in so many words, I will stay. It had simply accumulated, the way frost accumulates overnight without ever being caught in the act. One ordinary morning after another, until the whole shape of her life had rearranged itself around this valley, this house, this dog, without her noticing the precise hour it had happened. She wrote, that morning, a proper letter to her landlady in London, the kind of letter that closes one door carefully rather than leaving it swinging, and a shorter note to the office explaining that her leave of absence would need, she thought, to become something more permanent. And she found, sealing both envelopes at the kitchen table with Moss's chin resting warm across her foot, that her hand did not hesitate over either one. Jack Ridley called by later that same week, ostensibly to return a hurdle he had borrowed some time before her arrival, though Helen suspected, from the unhurried way he lingered at the gate afterward, that the errand had been mostly an excuse for company and news in equal measure. He told her, leaning on the wall in the thin winter sun, with his own dog sitting patiently at a small, respectful distance from Moss, that the valley had been talking, in its quiet way, about whether the young woman from London would settle or sell, and that he was glad, for what it was worth, to be able to tell them she seemed inclined to stay. He mentioned, too, almost as an afterthought, that the vicar down at the small stone chapel had been meaning to hold a proper blessing for Edwin, now that the family had arrived to be present for it, and asked, would Sunday suit? Sunday came clear and cold, the frost of the earlier week not fully lifted even at midday, and Helen walked down to the chapel with Moss at her heel, both of them, she thought, dressed as respectably as the occasion, and their respective wardrobes allowed. The chapel was a small plain building of the same grey stone as everything else in the valley, its yard given over to a scatter of leaning headstones, softened by centuries of the same weather that softened the walls, and the vicar, an unhurried man, not much younger than Mr. Fenn, conducted a brief, unfussy service that spoke more of a life well and quietly lived than of any grand claim to significance, which struck Helen as exactly the right register for a man who had, by every account she had gathered, preferred his truth spoken plainly and without ornament. Afterward, in the chapel yard, Jack Ridley's wife, a warm, brisk woman named Susan, drew Helen aside to show her a small worn stone set a little apart from the human graves near the yard's low back wall, engraved simply with a name, and, beneath it, the words, good and faithful. And Helen understood, looking at it, that this was where some earlier dog of the farm's long line had been laid, and that the tradition, evidently, ran deeper and further back than she had yet grasped. Susan told her there were 2 more such stones further along the wall, worn nearly smooth now, one of them old enough that its lettering had gone soft as a sigh, and that the valley, in its own way, had been quietly keeping this particular ledger of loyalty for a very long time, longer than any single family's memory could account for on its own. Helen walked back up to the farm that afternoon with Moss ranging easily ahead of her along the lane, the low winter sun throwing their shadows long and thin across the frosted grass, and found herself thinking, not unhappily, of the stone she had just seen, and of the 2 others older still, and of the plain, unremarkable fact that whatever this dog knew, whatever any of them had known before him, it had never once needed explaining to be believed, only witnessed, patiently, by whoever happened to be paying the right kind of attention at the time. That evening, the last of that first settled week, she banked the fire early and sat a long while in her grandfather's chair by the study window, properly sitting in it now rather than simply resting a hand on its arm, the small stones on the sill catching the last low light, the ledgers and the cloth-bound diary stacked neatly where she had left them, and Moss lying stretched the full length of the hearthrug with the particular boneless ease of a dog entirely certain of his welcome. She did not read or write or do anything in particular. She only sat and let the fire tick and settle, and felt the whole quiet weight of the house around her, its stone walls holding the day's thin warmth long after the light outside had gone, and understood that this, now, plainly and without further ceremony, was simply where she lived. Outside, the frost was already reforming on the yardstones, and somewhere out on the darkening fell, the flock had settled for the night in the shelter of the wall, and the beck ran on in the dark exactly as it always had. And the old dog by the fire, ears twitching now and then, at sounds too distant or too faint for Helen to ever quite catch, kept his own quiet, patient watch over all of it, the way he always had, the way, she suspected, he always would, knowing first, as he seemed to know everything, that the house was settled, and the night was safe, and there was, for now, nothing at all that needed doing but to rest. She began, in the weeks that gathered quietly after that first settled week, to learn the particular texture of an ordinary day in this valley, the kind of day that had no single remarkable feature to recommend it, and yet seemed, taken as a whole, to be exactly the sort of day she had not known she was missing. She would wake before the light properly came, roused not by any clock, but by the small shift of weight as Moss rose from the rug beside her bed and stood, patient and certain, until she stirred herself to follow him down through the cold, dark kitchen. The range would be coaxed back from its overnight ember into a proper glow, the kettle set to it, and while the water found its slow way toward boiling, she would stand at the door in her coat, watching the dark thin by degrees over the fell, the shapes of the walls and the outbuildings emerging one at a time, out of the grey the way a photograph might slowly develop, until the whole yard stood revealed, familiar now, in the pale hush before sunrise. The hens wanted letting out first, grumbling in their elderly, opinionated way at the cold, and the trough wanted checking, and the flock, when she walked up to them with Moss ranging easy and low beside her, wanted only a glance to be sure the night had passed without incident, which it generally had, though she had come to understand that this was less a matter of luck than of the dog having already, in his own quiet rounds before she was even awake, satisfied himself that all was well. Breakfast came after, usually simple, toast or porridge depending on the cold, eaten at the kitchen table with the window going gradually from grey to gold, and the dog settled beneath it, and she found she had come to treasure this particular hour above almost any other in the day. The stillness of it, the sense of a whole valley waking slowly around her without any hurry at all. The middle part of the day held whatever work the season demanded, mending a length of wall where a hard frost had worked a stone loose, or walking the boundary to check a gate, or simply sitting a while in the study going properly. At last, through the boxes and ledgers with a patience she had not always possessed in her London life, piecing together, page by careful page, the long, quiet record of a farm and a family she was only now beginning to understand she had always, in some underused corner of herself, belonged to. She wrote letters some afternoons to the few friends in London who had asked, with genuine, if slightly baffled kindness, whether she was quite sure about all this, and found her answers to them growing steadier and more certain with each week that passed. Less an argument she was making to convince them, and more a simple report of a fact already settled. The afternoons shortened quickly now, the season tipping further toward winter, and she learned to read the particular quality of light that meant she had perhaps an hour left before dusk, gold and low and slanting nearly flat across the in-by field, gilding the frost-whitened grass and throwing the dry stone walls into long, precise shadows that seemed, in that light, more like drawings of walls than the walls themselves. It was in this hour, without fail, that Moss would rise from wherever the day had settled him and come to find her, nudging her hand or simply standing at the door with his particular stillness. And she had learned by now never to hurry this part of the day, whatever else remained undone, because this was the hour he seemed to consider most his own, the hour for walking the fell and watching the light go, and sitting together in whichever quiet corner of the hillside he had decided the evening required. Some evenings he led her back to the flat rock above the shepherd's hut. Some evenings only as far as the gate at the end of the lane, where he would sit with his gaze fixed down the empty track in a posture she recognized. Now not as waiting for anything in particular, but simply as a kind of evening ritual, a last unhurried survey of the land before the dark properly came down and the day could be considered, by whatever private reckoning he kept, complete. She came to look forward to it as much as he seemed to. This last hour of light, this shared stillness that asked nothing of her, beyond sitting quietly and letting the valley do, once again, the same slow, beautiful thing it had done every evening for longer than anyone now living could account for. And each night, once the fire was banked and the lamps put out and the house settled into its familiar creaking quiet, she would climb the narrow stairs with Moss close behind her, his claws soft on the old wood, and lie listening to the wind find its way around the chimney and the sheep-call, low and occasional, somewhere out on the dark fell, and feel, every single night now, the same steady certainty she had felt on that very first evening, that whatever the house did not yet know how to tell her in words, the dog beside her had always, quietly and without fuss, known first, and would go on knowing first, for as long as she was fortunate enough to have him there, to know it. There would be more seasons to learn yet, more weather to read, more of the long, quiet ledger of the farm still waiting to be understood. But none of that needed settling tonight. Tonight there was only the fire gone soft and orange behind its guard, and the frost gathering, patient and silver, on the yardstones outside, and the old dog stretched warm along the hearthrug with his breathing slow and even, and the whole dark valley folded quietly around the house the way it had been folded, night after night, for longer than either of them could count. Helen let her eyes close and let the small sounds of the house carry her, unhurried, towards sleep. And somewhere in that last soft drift, before rest took her fully, she thought she felt the dog's tail move once against the floor, gentle and certain, as though even now, even here, at the very edge of sleep, he already knew that morning would come safely, and that all, for tonight, was well, far off, beyond the reach of the lamplight and the last low murmur of the fire. The fell held its long, patient silence. The walls and the becks and the sleeping flock all folded into the same soft, dark, and the valley kept doing, as it always had, the quiet, unremarkable work of simply continuing, night settling into night, season easing into season, one steady dog and one small stone house standing watch over all of it, needing no further explanation, asking nothing more of the world than to be allowed to go on, gently, exactly as it was, until morning found its own way back over the fell top, and the whole valley woke, unhurried, into another ordinary and entirely sufficient day. The deep of winter arrived properly, not long after. The way it seemed to arrive in this valley, without much preamble, one morning simply colder and stiller than the one before it, until Helen woke to find the world outside her window gone entirely white and silent, snow lying thick and unbroken across the in-by field, and softening every hard edge of wall and roof into something rounder and gentler than she had yet seen the farm look. Moss was at her door earlier even than usual, and there was, she noticed, a particular briskness to him that morning. None of the leisurely stretching he usually allowed himself before starting the day, and she understood, dressing quickly in the cold, that this was not a morning to keep him waiting. They went up to the flock together, through snow that came nearly to her knees in the drifted places. The dog, moving ahead of her with a low, economical stride that seemed built exactly for this kind of going, and found the sheep gathered close against the lee of the wall where the drifting had left them a clear, sheltered stretch of ground. All of them present and accounted for but one. Moss knew before Helen had finished counting. He was already casting out along the wall line, nose down, working a wide arc through the snow, with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything. And within what felt like no time at all he had found her, a young ewe cast on her side in a drift at the base of a rocky outcrop. Unable to right herself, the snow already beginning to bank against her. Helen worked her free with cold hands while Moss stood close, watching, offering nothing so dramatic as help exactly, but a kind of steady supervision that somehow made the work easier. And once the ewe had struggled up and shaken herself and rejoined the huddled flock with an indignant toss of her head, Helen sat back on her heels in the snow and laughed, a short, surprised sound that came out of her before she quite knew it was there. Because it had occurred to her all at once how thoroughly she had come to trust this animal's judgment over her own, and how little that trust had ever once been misplaced. They made their way back down together through the white hush of the morning. The only sounds the soft crunch of snow underfoot and, somewhere distant, a bird calling once and falling silent, and Helen thought, not for the first time, that there was a particular kind of listening this valley had taught her, a way of paying attention that had nothing to do with watching for danger, and everything to do with simply noticing what was actually there, moment by moment, rather than what she had expected or feared might be there instead. The snow held for the better part of a fortnight that year, softening the whole dale into a hush that made even the ordinary business of the days feel quieter than usual, and Helen spent a good deal of that stretch indoors by necessity. The fire kept high and steady, the study finally yielding up the last of its boxes to her patient sorting. She found, near the bottom of one, a small bundle of photographs, brittle at the edges, showing her grandfather younger than she had ever known him, standing in this same yard with a dog at his heel that was not Moss but plainly some earlier version of the same steady black and white line. The resemblance so exact in stance and expression that she found herself, for one disorienting moment, unsure which dog she was looking at. On the back of one, in a hand younger and steadier than the one she had come to know from the diary, her grandfather had written only a name and the words, "Good dog. First of the line I kept proper count of," and Helen understood, turning the photograph over in the lamplight with Moss's chin resting warm across her knee, that whatever unspoken tradition ran through this farm, her grandfather had known about it too, had known it well enough to be keeping a private accounting of his own, generation after generation, long before she had arrived to inherit the last chapter of it. Further down in the same box, beneath a folded oilcloth that had kept the damp from reaching them, she found a smaller bundle tied with faded ribbon, and understood almost at once that these were older still. Letters in a woman's hand, she recognized, with a small catch of breath, as her own mother's, sent from some earlier chapter of a life Helen had known only in the vaguest outline. She had always understood, in the unexamined way children absorb such things without ever quite asking after them properly, that her mother and grandfather had drifted from closeness long before Helen was old enough to notice the drifting happen, and that the reasons for it had never been offered to her in any form she could put a name to, only a kind of careful, well-meant silence that had settled over the subject the way frost settles over a window, thorough and impossible to see past. The letters, read slowly by lamplight with the fire ticking low and Moss's steady weight warm against her feet, told a plainer and gentler story than the silence had ever let her imagine. There had been no quarrel, no single wounding word she could find fault with on either side, only the ordinary drift of a daughter drawn to a city life her father had never much understood the appeal of, and a father, too, set in his own quiet ways to follow her there, even in his letters, so that the distance had simply widened, year on year, the way a path widens into a proper gap once enough seasons have passed without anyone walking it. Her mother's early letters were full of warmth and news, and small apologies for not visiting sooner. The later ones grew shorter, then stopped altogether. Some years before Helen herself had been old enough to notice their absence, and Helen understood, reading them in order, that she had inherited not only a farm and a dog but a particular unfinished shape of family silence, and that some part of her own long-postponed visits to this valley had likely been, without her ever consciously deciding so, an echo of that same old widening gap. She sat a long while with the last of the letters unfolded on her knee, feeling something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but some plainer, steadier thing lodged between the two, and found herself glad, in the end, simply to know the shape of it at last, rather than to go on carrying an unmarked absence she had never had the proper words to ask about. She thought she might write to her mother about it. In time, once she had turned the knowing over in herself a while longer, not to reopen any old wound, but simply to say that she understood now, a little better than before, why the visits had stopped, and that she did not hold it against anyone, least of all a father and daughter who had each, in their own quiet, stubborn way, simply loved a different kind of life too well to leave it for the other's sake. Moss, through all of this reading, kept his customary patient watch, lifting his head now and then to check her face in the lamplight, the way he seemed to check the weather, and settling again each time, apparently satisfied that whatever she was carrying was not, tonight, anything that required him to do more than simply stay close. Helen found, more than once, through that long, snowbound fortnight, that this was precisely the comfort she needed most. Not an answer to anything, simply a steady, warm weight that asked nothing of her grief and interrupted nothing of her thinking, and let her arrive, in her own time, at whatever quiet understanding the evening was offering. The nights grew properly cold through that stretch, cold enough that she took to leaving the kitchen door between the passage and the stairs, propped a little open so the last of the range's warmth could reach up into the rest of the house, and cold enough that Moss abandoned his usual rug beside her bed some nights in favor of the kitchen hearth entirely, curling close against the last low glow with the particular contentment of an old dog who had earned, by any fair reckoning, the right to choose his own warmest corner. Helen took to coming down once before her own bed to check the fire was properly banked, and found, each time, the same picture waiting for her, the dog stretched long and easy in the red light, one ear lifting at her step and settling again once he had confirmed, by whatever method he used to confirm such things, that it was only her. Jack Ridley came by often during that snowbound fortnight. partly out of the valley's old habit of checking on neighbors when the weather turned serious, and partly, Helen suspected, because his own dog had lately whelped a litter in the barn across the hill, and he seemed to find any excuse at all to talk about them at length. He brought word, one bright, cold afternoon, when the snow had begun at last to soften at its edges, that there was a pup in the litter he thought might suit the farm. If Helen ever found herself minded to think that far ahead, a small, bold creature, already showing, by his account, more interest in the sheep grazing beyond the barn door than any pup his own age rightly ought to have. Helen said she would think on it, though she suspected, even as she said it, that the thinking had already been done somewhere beneath the words. In the same quiet way, most of her decisions in this valley seemed to arrive fully formed before she had consciously reasoned her way to them. She mentioned it to Moss that evening, more out of habit now than any real expectation of an answer, and found him watching her with what she could only call patient approval, tail giving one slow sweep against the hearthrug, as though this too was simply the next obvious step in an arrangement he had long ago settled in his own mind. The pup arrived at the farm not long after, a small, restless bundle of black and white, with paws too large for the rest of him, and an expression of fierce, undiluted curiosity about absolutely everything, and Helen watched, over the following weeks, as Moss took him in hand, with the same unhurried, wordless authority he brought to every other task on the farm. He did not play with the pup, exactly, not in the tumbling, exuberant way she might have expected. He simply allowed himself to be followed, everywhere, at every hour, and let the small creature watch him check the trough, and walk the wall, and sit at the gate in the evening light, correcting him now and then with nothing more than a low-level look that seemed, remarkably, to be entirely sufficient instruction. She named him Fern, for no reason she could properly explain beyond the fact that the word had risen up in her one morning, watching him nose through the frost patterns on the kitchen window, and the name seemed, once given, to have always belonged to him. He grew through that winter with a speed that startled her, gawky and earnest, forever a half-step behind Moss on their morning rounds, and Helen found herself, without quite planning to, keeping her own quiet accounting of his progress the way her grandfather had once kept his, noting privately the day Fern first held steady at a gate without being told, the day he first cast a wide, correct arc around a straying ewe entirely of his own initiative, the day Moss, watching this small, unpolished echo of himself complete some simple task correctly, lay down afterward, with a long, settling sigh that Helen had come to recognize, by now, as a kind of contentment. The turn of the year came in the deepest part of that same winter, the shortest days pressing close together in a huddle of grey mornings and early dark, and the valley, in its own unhurried fashion, marked it with a small gathering at the chapel hall that Susan Ridley had insisted, in the friendly, immovable way of a woman used to being obeyed in matters of hospitality, Helen simply must attend. She went with some reluctance at first, unused still to being one among a room of strangers who all seemed, in the particular manner of small places, to already know a great deal about her, but found the reluctance dissolving almost as soon as she stepped through the door into warmth and lamplight, and the smell of mulled cider and wood smoke, and a great many pies cooling on a long trestle table. She was seated, without much choice in the matter, Beside the vicar, who turned out over the course of the evening to be a keener and gentler conversationalist than his brief chapel manner had suggested, and who told her, unprompted, that he had known her grandfather across the better part of 2 decades and had never once, in all that time, heard him raise his voice at man or beast, which the vicar seemed to regard as a rarer and more telling virtue than most people gave it credit for. He asked after Moss with real warmth, and after the new pup with open delight, and said, toward the end of the evening, in the easy way of a man passing on something he considered simply useful rather than remarkable, that the valley had a long memory for this sort of quiet continuity, farms and families and dogs handed down together generation on generation, and that people here took a particular, unspoken comfort in watching it happen again, as it seemed, this year, to be happening with her. She walked home late that night, under a sky scoured clear and bright by the cold. More stars overhead than she still, after all these months, had quite grown used to. Moss and the small pup both waiting at the gate for her return, with an eagerness that made her laugh aloud into the freezing air. And she thought, climbing the last stretch of lane toward the lit kitchen window, that she had not felt this thoroughly and simply welcomed anywhere in a very long time, not since the visits of her earliest childhood. Before the drifting had begun, the pup grew through the remaining weeks of that hard winter with a speed that continued to startle her. Shedding his early clumsiness in stages she could almost mark on a calendar, had she been the marking kind, learning the shape of the farm's daily rounds by dogged repetition, and, increasingly, by something that looked less like repetition and more like understanding. He took, early on, to a particular fascination with the flat rock above the shepherd's hut, following Moss up there of an evening and sitting, in careful and not entirely convincing imitation, in exactly the posture the older dog held, gazing out over the darkening valley with an expression of solemn concentration that Helen suspected had rather more to do with copying Moss than with any weather he had yet learned to read for himself. She found herself, some evenings, sitting a little apart from the pair of them on that same rock, watching the old dog and the young one side by side against the fading light, and thinking that this, more than anything else the year had shown her, was the plainest picture of what she had actually inherited, not simply a farm or a flock or even a single remarkable dog, but a whole, ongoing, wordless handing down of attention and patience from one generation to the next, a lesson that seemed to require no language at all beyond proximity and time, and the willingness of an old animal to be closely, faithfully followed. The last stubborn weeks of that winter loosened slowly, the snow retreating first from the low, sheltered corners of the in-by field, and last from the shaded northern folds of the fell, and Helen took to watching for the first small signs of the turning the way she had watched all year, for whatever the land seemed willing to show her, a scatter of snowdrops along the sheltered side of the chapel wall, appearing overnight the way they always seemed to, a fortnight before anything else in the valley showed the least inclination to stir. And, not long after, the first thin, uncertain call of a returning curlew somewhere high over the tops, a sound she had not heard before that year, and found, on first hearing it, oddly moving, some old note in it that seemed to promise the whole slow machinery of the seasons was about to begin turning again in earnest. Moss marked the change before the snowdrops did, in his own quiet fashion, growing restless of an evening in a way she had come to recognize now, as thoroughly as she recognized any of his other small signals, pacing the yard a little longer before settling, watching the darkening fell with a particular alertness that seemed, this time, less about weather or trouble than about simple anticipation, the way a person might watch for the post on a day they were expecting good news. Helen found she had learned, over the long turning of that first year, to trust these small, unexplained signals of his, every bit as much as she trusted her own gradually sharpening instincts, and so she was hardly surprised, some mornings later, to wake to the particular quality of light that meant the year had properly turned at last, the fell softening from its long grey winter patience into the first tentative green of the spring still to come. Spring came late that year, but came properly when it came, the fell greening almost overnight once the last of the snow had gone, the becks running loud and full with melt, and with it came the lambing, the busiest and most demanding stretch of the whole farming year, the one Jack Ridley had warned her about with the particular relish of a man describing an ordeal he has grown fond of despite himself. Helen found she did not mind the broken sleep and the long, cold hours in the shed nearly as much as she had expected, buoyed by a kind of purposeful exhaustion that felt entirely different from the thin, directionless tiredness of her old London life. It was in the deep hours of one of those lambing nights, the whole shed lit only by a single hung lamp and the small urgent sounds of the flock settling and shifting, that Moss did the thing Helen would remember longest and most clearly of anything that happened that spring. He had been dozing, or seeming to doze, by the shed door, and rose all at once, ears forward, and walked out into the dark beyond the lamp's reach, without any hesitation at all, the way he had once walked to meet her at the gate on her very first evening. Helen followed, more out of trust by now than understanding, and found him standing at the far corner of the in-by field beside a ewe laboring alone in trouble, well beyond where either of them ought reasonably to have thought to look at that hour. And it was only because he had known, in whatever wordless way he always seemed to know, that both ewe and lamb came through that night at all. She sat afterward in the straw with the new lamb, damp and impossibly small, tucked warm against her coat while its mother found her feet, and Fern crept close to sniff at it with an expression of such total astonishment that Helen laughed aloud again. The same short, surprised sound from the snow that morning, and Moss lay a little apart from all of it, watching with the settled satisfaction of a creature who has done, once again, exactly what he was always going to do, and expects no particular credit for having done it. The lambing eased, by degrees, into the fuller business of proper spring, the fell greening thick and quick now over every fold and hollow, the becks settling from their snow-melt roar into a steadier, more companionable running, and Helen found the days lengthening around her in a way that seemed to lengthen something in herself as well, some patience she had not known. She possessed, stretching out to fill all the extra daylight the season kept handing her. She took to walking the higher fell in the long evenings now, further than she had ventured before, Moss ranging comfortably ahead and Fern casting wide, energetic loops around them both, and found parts of the farm's boundary she had not yet properly seen. A hidden fold where the earliest orchids came up through the turf, a broken lime kiln half swallowed by bracken that Jack Ridley later told her had not been fired in his grandfather's lifetime, let alone his own. The haymaking came on with the first spell of proper settled weather, a fortnight of hard, satisfying, communal labor that seemed to draw half the valley together at once. Jack Ridley's tractor and trailer working the near fields while Helen and Susan and a rotating cast of neighbors turned and gathered by hand along the steeper ground the machinery could not reach. And she found, working until her arms ached and her back complained in ways her old desk-bound London body had never once required of her, that she had never in her life felt quite so usefully, thoroughly tired. Moss and fern kept to the field margins through all of it, out from underfoot, but never far. And more than once, it was Moss who noticed, before any of the working humans had, a change coming in the weather glass of the sky, rising to his feet and turning his head westward in a way that sent Jack Ridley calling the whole party in a full hour before the first fat drops of an unseasonal shower came down on hay that had, thanks to the warning, already been safely stacked. It was in the fullness of that same summer, the evening stretching so long and pale that Helen had taken to leaving the lamps unlit until well past what would have counted, in London, as a proper bedtime, that the valley held its small annual show in the meadow behind the chapel. A modest gathering of livestock classes and homemade produce, and, at its center, a sheepdog trial that Jack Ridley had been quietly encouraging her, all spring, to enter. She had resisted at first, certain she understood nothing of the finer points of the discipline, but had allowed herself, in the end, to be talked into standing at the post with a whistle she barely knew how to use, trusting entirely to the animal at her side rather than to any skill of her own. Moss ran that trial as though he had been waiting his whole patient life for exactly this small, unremarkable afternoon, gathering the released sheep from the top of the field with an economy of movement that drew a low, appreciative murmur from the watching crowd, and bringing them down and through the course's awkward gates with barely a glance back at Helen for instruction. Reading, she understood, watching him work, not her whistle but some steadier communication between them that had been building all year without either of them naming it. He placed well, by any measure, the valley cared to keep. And Jack Ridley, clapping her on the shoulder afterward, with unguarded pride, said he had not seen an old dog run a course that clean and unhurried since Edwin himself had last stood at that same post, some years before Helen had been old enough to properly remember it. Fern ran the novice class later that same afternoon, rougher and less certain but showing, even in his mistakes, the unmistakable shape of the same patient method Moss had spent the winter teaching him, and Helen stood at the rail between the two runs, with something swelling in her chest that she recognized, eventually, as a very plain and uncomplicated pride, not in herself, particularly, but in the whole quiet, unbroken line of care that had produced, out of one old dog and one young one and one small, unglamorous valley, an afternoon this satisfying to witness. The whole meadow, through both runs and long after, held the particular unhurried festivity of a valley show that had been happening in more or less this same field for longer than anyone present could properly date, bunting strung between two old oaks at the far hedge, a trestle of jams and baked goods, judged with great seriousness by a retired schoolteacher who had, Susan Ridley confided, been judging the same categories for the better part of 3 decades, and a cluster of children running loose between the stalls with the particular boundless energy of a long, bright afternoon and no lessons the next morning to dampen it. Helen sat a good while on the trampled grass afterward, with a paper cup of the vicar's mulled cordial. Moss stretched warm beside her, and Fern collapsed in the ecstatic, boneless sleep of a young dog, who has finally run himself thoroughly and satisfyingly out, and thought that she could not, if she tried, have pictured a fuller or gentler way to spend an ordinary Saturday than this one. Mr. Fenn attended the show as well, as he seemed to attend most things of consequence in the valley, and sought her out afterward over tea in the chapel hall to finish off, in his careful, unhurried way, the last of the paperwork attached to the estate, remarking, as he gathered his folder closed for what he said he suspected would be the final time, that he had rarely in his long career seen an inheritance settle so completely, so quickly into someone's actual life, rather than remaining merely a piece of property they held at arm's length. Helen said she thought the credit for that belonged rather more to the dog than to herself. And Mr. Fenn, folding his glasses away with a small private smile, said he had come, over the years, to suspect that this valley's dogs deserved rather more credit for a great many things than anyone quite gave them. She wrote to her mother again not long after that show, a longer letter this time than the first careful one she had sent that winter, describing the trial and the haymaking and the small worn stone in the chapel yard, and received back, some weeks later, a reply longer and warmer than any she could recall from childhood, her mother writing that she had long wanted to make the visit north again herself, and had simply never found, or perhaps never properly looked for, the courage to begin it, and asking tentatively whether the summer might yet have room for a guest before it turned. Helen wrote back the same evening to say that it would, gladly, and found, sealing the envelope at the kitchen table with both dogs stretched warm across her feet, that some old, careful silence in her own chest had finally, quietly, begun to lift as well. Her mother arrived on a warm, hazy afternoon in the fat middle of that summer, stepping down at the same small junction platform Helen herself had first arrived at, looking older and smaller than Helen quite remembered, and yet standing there with her single case and her uncertain smile, unmistakably a woman returning to somewhere she had once, long ago, properly belonged. They drove up together in Jack Ridley's borrowed car, mostly quiet, both of them looking out at the same climbing hedgerows and thinning villages Helen had watched on her own first journey, and Helen noticed her mother's hand tighten just slightly on the door handle as the farmhouse first came into view around the last bend of the lane. Moss met the car at the gate, exactly as he had met Helen herself, unhurried, certain, tail beginning its slow, familiar sweep, and Helen watched her mother go quite still at the sight of him, one hand pressed briefly to her mouth, before crouching, careful of her traveling clothes, to let the old dog press his head against her knee in precisely the same wordless greeting he had once given Helen. "He has the same look," her mother said, when she trusted her voice again, that his father had. The very same look. And Helen understood, watching them together in the gold afternoon light, that her mother had known this line of dogs too, once, before the long drifting years had carried her away from them, and that some of what Moss seemed to know first, he had perhaps first learned to know in the company of this same woman, decades before Helen herself had been born to inherit any of it. They walked the fell together over the following days, at an easy, unambitious pace suited to her mother's unfamiliarity with the climb, moss and fern ranging patiently around them, and her mother pointed out, here and there, small features of the land Helen had not yet properly noticed for herself. A particular twisted thorn tree she said she used to climb as a girl, the exact spot along the beck where her own mother, Helen's great-grandmother, had once taught her to spot trout holding steady in the current, the low place in the wall where, her mother said with a small rueful laugh, She had once got thoroughly stuck attempting a shortcut home after dark. Helen listened to all of it with the particular hunger of someone filling in, piece by careful piece, a map of her own family she had not known. Until this visit, how incomplete she had been carrying. On the evening before her mother's visit ended, they climbed together to the flat rock above the shepherd's hut, slower going than Helen's usual pace, but companionable for the slowness, and sat as the light went from gold to rose in its familiar, unhurried way. Moss settling between them, as though he had always known this exact configuration of the evening, was the one that had been missing. Her mother was quiet a long while, looking out over the valley she had once left, and had now, however briefly, returned to, and said, at last, that she was glad, more glad than she had properly known how to say in any of her earlier hesitant letters, that Helen had come north when the letter arrived, and had stayed and had let the place teach her whatever it seemed to want to teach. "I ran from all this once," her mother said, watching the first star arrive low over the western, fell exactly where it always did, because I thought I wanted a different sort of life, and I did want it, and I do not regret it, not truly, but I have missed this light more years than I ever let myself properly say aloud. Helen took her mother's hand on the cooling stone, and neither of them said anything further for a long while, and Moss lay warm and steady between them, keeping his same patient watch over the darkening valley. And Helen thought that whatever else this year had given her, it had given her back, in the end, rather more of her own family than she had known. On that Tuesday in London, she had lost. On her last full morning at the farm, her mother rose early enough to walk the low round with Helen before breakfast, letting the hens out and checking the near trough with a competence that surprised them both, old habits surfacing in her hands before her memory had properly caught up to them. And she stood a long while afterward at the kitchen window, watching the mist lift slowly off the in-by field, saying nothing, simply watching in the particular quiet way of someone taking careful private inventory of a view she did not know when she would next have the chance to stand in front of. Her mother left a few days later with a promise, offered easily this time, and without the old hesitation, to come again before the year was out and the farmhouse settled back into its familiar rhythm of 2 dogs and 1 woman, and the long, unhurried business of a summer running down toward autumn. Helen found, in the quieter weeks that followed, that she thought of her grandfather rather more gently now than she had even in the early tenderness of her arrival, understanding him now not simply as a man she had failed to visit enough, but as one half of an old, ordinary, entirely forgivable family drifting that had, in its own delayed and patient way, finally been mended. The seasons turned on, as they do in a valley like this, without much ceremony and without asking anyone's permission, and Helen found, somewhere in the midst of that first full turning, that she had stopped thinking of herself as someone visiting her grandfather's farm, and had become, without any single decisive moment she could point to, simply someone who lived there, whose hands knew the weight of a gate latch without looking, whose ear had learned to sort the ordinary night sounds of the valley from anything that might actually need attending to. She wrote to her old London friends less often now, not from any falling away of affection, but because there was, increasingly, less to explain and more simply to be getting on with. And she found, on the rare occasions she did write, that her letters had begun to sound, in their unhurried attention to weather and stock, and the small doings of neighbors, rather like the ones her grandfather used to send her. She noticed, too, a change in herself that she found harder to put into words, a growing habit of trusting some quiet certainty in her own chest before she had properly reasoned her way to it. Stepping out to check the trough some mornings before any obvious reason presented itself, only to find the pipe had frozen overnight and wanted clearing or feeling on a still bright afternoon that gave no outward sign of anything, a faint, unaccountable urge to bring the flock down early, and being proven right within the hour by a squall that came in fast and hard off the tops. She said nothing of this to Jack Ridley, not wanting to seem fanciful, but she caught Moss watching her more than once, on these occasions, with an expression she had come to recognize from the very first evening at the gate, an expression that seemed to say only that this, too, was simply the land doing to her, patiently and in its own time, what it had always done to everyone who stayed long enough to let it. Sunday suppers had become, without either family quite deciding it formally, a settled fixture between the two farms by that point in the year, Susan Ridley arriving most weeks with something warm wrapped in a cloth and staying on afterward over tea while Jack and Helen compared notes on flock and weather and the small ongoing education of two young dogs, one his and one hers, who had taken to each other with an easy, wrestling friendliness, quite unlike the older dog's more measured companionship. Helen found these suppers had become, over the unhurried course of the year, one of the fixed points she oriented the rest of her week around, the way she had once oriented a London week around obligations that felt, looking back on them now, considerably less nourishing than a shared pot of stew, and an hour of unhurried talk beside someone else's fire. It was at one such supper, deep in that same stretch of thinning autumn light, that Jack Ridley asked her, with the same easy directness he brought to most things, whether she had given any proper thought yet to which of Fern's own pups, should he ever throw a litter worth keeping, she meant to raise on at the farm herself, and Helen found the question arriving in her, not as a decision still to be made, but as one already, quietly, settled, the way so many of her decisions in this valley now seemed to arrive. She said she rather thought she would raise the whole litter through its first weeks and see which pup showed, the way Fern himself once had, the particular fascination with the flat rock and the wide, quiet fields that seemed, in this family of dogs at least, to mark the ones worth keeping. Susan Ridley, gathering the supper things with brisk efficiency, remarked that it was a rare comfort, in a valley that had seen more than its share of farms sold off to strangers over the years, to watch one instead simply carry on in careful, capable hands. And Helen, walking the Ridleys partway home afterward, under a sky already thick with early stars, found herself thinking that whatever she had once imagined an inheritance might feel like, arriving as it had on that unremarkable Tuesday in London, she had not imagined it would feel, a year on, quite this much like belonging. The harvest came in ahead of that same autumn's turning, a smaller and plainer affair up on the higher ground than the grand golden harvests she had once pictured from storybooks and southern postcards, but satisfying in its own right, a scatter of late oats brought in from the one sheltered field that grew anything but grass, and a good crop of apples from the two old trees leaning against the south wall of the farmhouse that Helen had not even properly noticed were fruiting, until Susan Ridley arrived one morning with a basket and the brisk suggestion that they had better get to them before the wasps. And the first proper frost did the job for them. They spent a companionable afternoon up ladders and along low branches, Fern investigating every windfall with grave curiosity and Moss dozing in a patch of thin autumn sun at the foot of the largest tree, and the kitchen, by evening, smelled of stewing apples and the particular sweet sharpness of a harvest properly gathered rather than merely watched from a distance. She kept a good store of it down in the cool of the pantry. Jars of stewed apple and a few of a rough cider Jack Ridley had shown her how to press, lined up along the shelf beside the last, half-empty jar of her grandfather's own bramble jam, which she had been rationing out carefully all year rather than see the final taste of him vanish from the larder entirely, she thought, setting the new jars beside the old, that this was perhaps the plainest measure of a year properly lived in a place like this. Not any single dramatic change, but simply a shelf, growing steadily, fuller, with the small, ordinary produce of seasons she had watched turn, one into the next, with her own two hands finally in the midst of the turning, rather than merely observing it from some careful distance. Michaelmas came and went with the small, quiet observance the valley gave it. A service at the chapel and a shared supper afterward in the hall. Geese mentioned more as an old joke about the season than any dish actually on the table. And Helen found herself sitting among neighbors who had become, over the course of a single turning year, something closer to family than she had expected any new arrival could earn so quickly, filled with a contentment so plain and unremarkable that she nearly missed noticing it was there at all, the way one sometimes fails to notice warmth until asked directly whether one is cold. It was in the quiet stretch of days just after Michaelmas, the light thinning fast now toward the year's true turning, that Fern did the thing which settled, for Helen, any last small doubt she had privately been carrying about whether the valley's old gift had truly passed on with him, or had simply been Moss's alone to hold. She had gone up to the higher pasture later than usual, one still, unremarkable afternoon, nothing in the sky or the air to suggest anything but an ordinary evening ahead, and had noticed Fern grow suddenly restless at the gate, pacing and glancing back down the lane in a manner she had only ever before seen in Moss on that very first evening, waiting for her arrival. She followed his gaze and saw nothing, not for a long moment, and had almost turned back to the ordinary business of counting the flock in when she caught, far down the lane, the small figure of Jack Ridley's youngest grandson, out on his own for the first time on some errand between the two farms, walking steadily enough, but favoring one leg in a way that suggested, even at that distance, some small mishap along the way. Fern had known before she had properly seen the boy at all. Had known, she understood now, in exactly the same, wordless, attentive way. Moss had once known, a ewe was cast beyond the reach of ordinary sight, and she found herself hurrying down the lane with the young dog ranging eagerly ahead, arriving to find the boy sat on the wall, nursing a twisted ankle from a stumble in the ruts, more embarrassed than hurt, glad enough of the company and the offer of an arm back up to the farmhouse. She told Jack Ridley of it that same evening, walking the boy home herself, rather than trust him alone a second time on legs, not fully steady, and Jack Ridley, listening with the particular unsurprised satisfaction of a man hearing a story he had half expected all along, said only that it sounded as though the valley had found, in Fern, exactly what it always seemed to find in a dog raised properly by an elder who knew the whole business of attention and patience better than most people ever managed to learn it. Helen walked home alone in the last of that evening's light, Moss waiting for her at the gate in his old accustomed place, and told him, crouching to rest her forehead briefly against his graying head, that his pupil had done him proud, and found herself, absurdly, and without any embarrassment at all, close to tears over an afternoon that had, in the end, amounted to nothing more than a twisted ankle and a boy walked safely home. She thought about it a good deal in the quiet days that followed, turning over what it meant. Precisely, that the gift, if gift it truly was, had passed so cleanly from one dog to the next without any ceremony beyond an old animal's patient willingness to be closely followed. She thought that perhaps this was the plainest lesson the whole valley had to teach, quieter even than the lesson about attention she had already begun to draw from Moss's example, that whatever mattered most in a place like this was never kept by any one keeper alone, dog or person either, but simply handed onward, a little at a time, through nothing grander than proximity and patience and the willingness of each new keeper to watch closely enough, for long enough, to notice what needed noticing, before it needed pointing out. Autumn returned in its turn, gold again on the fell where it had been gold on her first evening there. The same slant of low sun through the same gap in the same wall, and Helen found herself standing at the flat rock above the shepherd's hut on an evening not unlike that very first one, Moss settling beside her with the particular stiffness of joints grown a season older, Fern ranging a little further afield now, confident and capable, casting easy arcs around a straying ewe, without any need of instruction at all. She thought, watching him, of the small, worn stone in the chapel yard, and of the two others older still, and understood, without any sadness attached to the understanding, that the ledger her grandfather had kept, and his father before him for all she knew, was simply continuing now through her own hand, one line at a time, one dog at a time, exactly as it always had. She thought, too, of the letter that had started it all, arriving on that unremarkable Tuesday, in a city that felt, now, like something she had read about rather than lived, and of Mr. Fenn's careful, apologetic voice describing a dog who seemed to be waiting for something nobody quite liked to guess at. She understood now, sitting on the cooling stone with the whole dale spread gold and rose below her, exactly what he had been waiting for, and exactly what it had cost him, in his own patient way, to wait for it without complaint through all those solitary weeks. She rested her hand on his graying head, and he pressed up into the touch the way he always had, unhurried, entirely certain, and the light went from gold to rose to that same deep, unbroken blue, and the first star arrived low over the western shoulder of the fell, exactly where it always did. She noticed, sitting there with the year folding gently to a close around her, that Moss had slowed in small ways. She had been careful, for some months now, not to dwell on too heavily, a little longer rising in the mornings, a little more content these days to let Fern take the wider casts across the fell, while he held the closer, steadier ground, a little more inclined, of an evening, to lean rather than simply sit beside her on the cooling stone. She did not let herself think of this as an ending, exactly, only as the plain and unhurried shape of a life well spent, moving, as every life on this farm eventually moved, toward its own gentle season of rest. And she found she could hold that thought now, without the old fear such thoughts might once have carried in her London life, because she had watched, all year, precisely how this valley taught a person to meet such things, not with alarm, but with attention and patience, and the quiet trust that whatever came would be met, when it came, exactly as everything else here had been met, steadily and without unnecessary noise. She thought that this, in the end, was the plainest truth the whole year had been teaching her, longer and more thoroughly than any single lesson about lambing or weather or the mending of walls, that to know a thing first was not, and had never been, some rare or mystical gift belonging only to a certain line of remarkable dogs, but simply the reward of paying close, patient, unhurried attention to a place, and the creatures in it for long enough that its rhythms became legible. The way a language becomes legible to anyone willing to sit with it patiently enough, for long enough, without demanding it, explain itself all at once. Moss had always known first, she understood now, not because he possessed some uncanny sense closed to the rest of them, but because he had simply never once, in his whole steady life, stopped paying attention, and the valley, in its turn, had simply never once failed to reward that attention with the small early warnings it seemed always willing to offer anyone patient enough to notice them. And she understood, too, sitting there with his graying head heavy and warm against her knee, that this was precisely the inheritance her grandfather had truly left her. More than the stone walls, or the flock, or even the farmhouse itself. Not a dog, exactly, though the dog had been the truest and gentlest teacher of it, but a whole quiet way of living inside a place rather than merely alongside it, of letting the land and its creatures teach a person, slowly and without any hurry at all, how to notice what mattered before it needed pointing out. She thought that whatever came, in whatever season it eventually chose to come, she would carry that particular lesson forward, the way the valley itself carried everything forward, patiently, unhurriedly, one generation and one dog and one turning year at a time. They walked down together as the dark properly settled, Fern trotting ahead now, with the easy confidence of a dog who had learned this path from the only teacher who mattered, and the farmhouse light was burning in the kitchen window, exactly as it always was, warm and steady and entirely certain of itself. And Helen understood, crossing the yard in the last of the blue evening, that whatever else this year had asked of her, it had given her back something she had not known, on that Tuesday in London, that she was even missing. That night, with the fire settled low and the house gone quiet around them, Helen sat a long while in her grandfather's chair with the cloth-bound diary open on her knee, and took up a pen and began, in a hand she noticed had grown steadier and plainer over the year, to add her own first entry to its final pages, noting the season and the lambing count, and the small ordinary triumph of Fern's first solo gather, and then, beneath it, almost without meaning to, a line about the dog who had taught them both everything that mattered, and who slept now, exactly as he had every night since her arrival, stretched warm and certain along the hearthrug, keeping his own quiet watch over the house and the valley and all the ordinary sufficient days still to come. She closed the diary and banked the fire, watching the last visible flame settle and steady into a low, even glow behind the guard, the way it had settled every night since her very first evening in this house, and climbed the narrow stairs, with Moss following slow and steady behind her, his old joints taking the steps a little more carefully now than they once had, pausing on the small half-landing the way he had begun, lately, to pause, before gathering himself for the last few steps, with the same quiet determination he brought to every other task the day required of him. Fern went ahead of them both, bounding up in 2 easy strides and turning at the top to wait, tail moving, for the slower pair to catch him up, and curled himself, without asking, into the small space at the foot of the bed that Moss no longer seemed to mind sharing. The two of them arranging themselves into the same familiar shape they took every night now. One old and steady, one young and still learning, warm together at the foot of the same bed that had once, on her very first night in this house, held only a stranger and a single patient dog, uncertain whether she would come to trust him. Outside, the valley settled into its familiar dark, the becks running on exactly as they always had, through seasons uncounted before this one, and seasons still to come after it. The fell holding its long, patient silence over sheep and stone and sleeping house alike. The wind finding its same worn path around the chimney it had always found, and somewhere out on the darkening in-by field, a lone ewe called once, low and unhurried, and fell quiet again, answered by nothing but the deeper quiet that followed. Helen lay listening to the two dogs breathing slow and even in the dark beside her, their breathing settling, by degrees, into something almost matched, almost a single, steady rhythm shared between an old life nearing its unhurried close and a young one only beginning to learn the shape of its own. And she found the sound of it, rather than troubling her, carried her further and further from the last waking edges of the day, down into something warmer and slower and entirely without worry, she thought, drifting towards sleep, of the small cream envelope that had once seemed the beginning of an ending, and understood now, lying warm beneath the same roof that letter had led her to, that it had been instead the quiet beginning of everything that mattered most to her, now the farmhouse settling its old stones around her each night, the way it had settled them for her grandfather and his mother before him, and however many quiet generations before that. The fell holding its long, unhurried silence outside her window, exactly as it always had, the two dogs breathing steady and warm at the foot of her bed, one teaching the other, without a single word between them, the same patient attentiveness that had first been taught to some earlier dog by some earlier keeper of this same valley, longer ago than any ledger still remaining could properly account for. She thought, too, that she understood now, fully and without any further need of explaining it to herself, exactly what her grandfather had meant in his letter about trusting whatever the dog seemed to be telling her. And she thought that she had done exactly that all year, in ways large and small, and that it had brought her, by the longest and gentlest of roads a person could ask for, exactly home. The house held its warmth around her, the way it always had. The fell kept its silence, unbroken and complete. Somewhere below the window, a last log settled in the banked fire, with a small, soft collapse of ember. And somewhere further off still, out past the wall and the trough and the sleeping flock, the whole dark valley simply continued, patient and unhurried, doing what it had always done, night folding gently into night, exactly as it would go on doing long after this particular night, this particular house, this particular quiet company of an old dog and a young one and one steady, settled woman had each, in their own turn, drifted off to sleep. And somewhere in the last soft moments before sleep took her fully, Helen felt, quite certainly, without needing a single word to confirm it, that all of it, the house, the valley, the two dogs breathing steady in the dark, the whole unhurried turning year still to come, already knew, long before she did, exactly what she meant to do. She meant to stay. She meant to keep the ledger. She meant to let this place go on, patiently, teaching her, and whoever came after her, whatever it had always so quietly known first. The fire held its low, steady glow behind the guard. The valley held its dark, and in the small room at the top of the stairs, in the old stone farmhouse at the end of the lane, 3 sleepers settled, one by one, into the same deep, unhurried rest the whole dale seemed to keep, night after night, for anyone patient enough to have finally, properly, come home, sleep well,